These are the exact settings I use for my real estate photography business for both HDR and Flambient photography. I have a lot of experience shooting both of these because usually when I'm shooting luxury AirBNBs, I shoot with flash, but for 99% of my MLS shoots, I'm using HDR. And being flexible with both styles has led me to be very flexible with the jobs I can take, from regular houses all the way to like multi-million-dollar houses. First, to start with the gear I use, the camera I use is the Sony a7 IV, which is a full frame camera, but you can shoot real estate photography with any kind of sensor camera, honestly. For the lens, I'm using a Sigma 16-28 lens. This is the lens I use for pretty much all of my shots except for detail shots when I'm shooting AirBNBs. And you're gonna wanna make sure you have a wide angle lens. So for a full frame camera, that's like a 14 or a 16 millimeter, and for a crop sensor, it's like 10 or 11. I also use this Sigma 50mm lens when I'm shooting AirBNBs for the detail shots. And other than my camera, I'm just using a regular Benro tripod and gearball head, which I recommend for shooting real estate. Alright, I'm gonna start by showing you how we shoot HDR photography, which is how I do pretty much all of the MLS listings I shoot. I'm gonna start by putting the camera in aperture priority mode, and I'm gonna set the aperture to f8. We're pretty much never gonna leave f8. That's what we shoot all the photos on except for the vignette shots. The next setting we're gonna change is we're gonna go here and press this button to open up the drive mode, and we're gonna set it to continuous bracket 2 EV 5 images, and that's basically gonna tell the camera to take 5 images per time we click the shutter button. So it's gonna take one really dark photo, one darker photo, one evenly exposed photo, one overexposed photo, and one really overexposed photo, and that's what we're gonna blend in editing to be able to create the final images that we deliver to the client. We shoot 5 images for interiors because I like having the access to the extended dynamic range, but when I shoot exteriors, I set it to 3 images because I find adding that extra overexposed image outside just ends up blowing the whole thing out in editing, so 3 stops is fine. The next thing I'm going to change is the white balance, which I'm going to affect by pressing C1 here on the Sony a7 IV. For interiors, I set the balance to auto white balance so I don't have to worry about it, and for when I shoot exteriors, we scroll down here to custom white balance color temperature, and I set it to 5600K exposure, which is the color temperature for the sun. After that, I'm going to set the ISO by pressing this button right here. For interiors, I started off at 400 ISO and I stay there most of the time. If the house is really dark, I'll bump it up to 800 to increase the shutter speed a little bit. And when I'm shooting exteriors, I start at ISO 100, which works most of the time when it's really sunny day. If it's cloudy, I'll go ahead and bump it up to 200. And if it's really windy, like you got trees and grass just blowing around, you can go ahead and crank it all the way up to 800. So you can have the fastest shutter speeds possible to be able to freeze motion. And then for focus area, I just set it to regular zone focus and I move the box that comes up as I need to, but most of the time I just keep it there in the center and that works. And that's pretty much all the settings I change for shooting HDR interiors and exteriors. Really, you just set the camera at f8, bracket your shots, set the auto white balance, and you're good to go. Now I'm going to show you how I shoot Flambient with the flash. I'll start off by showing the control unit. It is this Pro CX something, I don't know. It's by Godox. I used the Canon one instead of the Sony because I think there was a bug with white balance or something like that before. I don't know, it still works just the same. This is what connects the camera to the flash, which I use the 8200. This is a modifier made by Godox. I don't know what it's called, but it's basically their version of a mag mod. I've been using it lately. It's pretty cool. It's basically the same thing, honestly. It just has a little bit more flexibility if you're into that. This is the thing that basically just tells the camera to shoot whenever I take an image. Just like that. So the Sony a7 IV has 3 of these modes that you can have custom settings set like as presets, and I use that for my flash ambient photography. I learned this system from Jeremiah from CQ Media, so shout out to him. But basically, I'll go in more detail this another time, but this first mode is what I use to capture the ambient shots of the image. For this one, I set the shutter speed manually, so I'm in control of the main exposure. And then I'm shooting brackets, but at 1 stop apart instead of 2 stops apart, still shooting 5 images. The white balance I have set to auto still, and I have the ISO at 400. This is basically almost the exact same setup as my HDR setup, just set to the first mode for me to be able to do this quickly. The second mode is for I use to shoot my flash shot. Most of the same settings were still at f8, but I pumped the ISO up to 800 to be able to get the most power out of the 8200 that I can. That's a little trick there. And I start the shutter speed at 1/200th of a second because that's the fastest that you can set it before you start to get banding when you shoot when you shoot with flash, and to increase the exposure, I just add to that, and that's how I basically determine the light level. When I shoot flash, I try to aim for about -1 exposure. That usually cuts enough of the ambient light for me to start adding in flash. And then for the white balance, I have a custom white balance set to 4400K. I find that just what works best, and we could always change that later in post. Drive mode is just single shot because I'm just shooting one flash image at a time. And then the third mode is what I use to shoot my window pulls. For this shot, I have the ISO set to 100, still at f8, and I set the shutter speed manually to expose for the exteriors. And since I'm shooting outside, I have the white balance set to auto, or no, I have the white balance set to daylight, and that's what allows me to shoot the window pulls.